Hi, class. So we're going to move on now to talking about another type of Chinese art, specifically focusing on porcelain. So China is known for its creation of many different types of ceramics, porcelain being one of them, and particularly porcelain because porcelain becomes a really major type of artwork that becomes really popular within China, but also within trade networks. So other countries that China had trade with became really interested in the type of porcelain they were producing because it was so done with such high craftsmanship and it was so beautifully done. And it was done with techniques that weren't known in other parts of the world, like in Europe in particular, it becomes really popular. It takes them a little bit of time to develop the same techniques to mimic what is being produced in China. So this becomes a luxury object, something that becomes synonymous with China. Even today, when you hear the word, people will say like, "Oh, I have, China. My grandmother's China," right? Like that even the word for porcelain has become synonymous with China because we associate those two things so distinctly. Uh, the example we're looking at here is a beautiful example of one of the really early examples of blue and white porcelain that becomes very, very popular, very, again, synonymous with Chinese culture, Chinese production. These two vases are known as the David vases. It's a little bit of a misnomer because it's called the David vases because there was an Englishman, Sir Percival David, basically, who much, much later after the creation of this acquires them, and so they become synonymous with his name. But this actually was created several centuries before he acquired them during the Yuan dynasty, which is really this period of time where porcelain is known to have flourished and really masterful technique is established. Ceramics again had been established as a technique for a long time up until now, but this particular type, this is happens during the 13th century under the Yuan dynasty, which is technically under Mongol rule. Um, these particular vases were made for a Taoist temple, so this was meant to be in a religious space, and it was created by a donor. So basically, it was commissioned by a donor, and then they donated it to the temple. And calligraphy on it, which I have a picture of the calligraphy on the next slide that shows that it includes the date and the name of the donor. So there's this like association between those two. Um, this is also a really great example to show the exchange, the trade networks that are really important, particularly along the Silk Road at this time. The Silk Road is this trade network basically that connected parts of Europe to the Middle East all the way to Asia. And this white and blue porcelain that becomes so emblematic of Chinese culture is actually very reliant on resources found in Iran, so from the Persian Empire. So the Persians had they had access to cobalt. Cobalt is a mineral that is used to create this really rich blue color that you see in this white and blue porcelain of these vases. And so really the production of this type of porcelain is reliant on trade with the Persians. The shapes that you see here come from a much longer lineage of types of ritual vessels, particularly bronze ritual vessels that go back for like hundreds of years at this point. And this particular type of vessel is really interesting though because you're able to draw designs on it, right? Like through this glazing and firing process. So we have this beautiful inclusion of all of these different figures. We have dragons, phoenixes, elephants, there's foliage, there is symbols of these little objects at the bottom. There's lots of different things going on here. And scholars have been able to unpack, the symbolism associated with each of these elements. Some important ones, the dragons stand for imperial power, strength, good fortune. Phoenixes are representative of harmony and rebirth. Elephants are representative of wisdom and strength, and you can see them on the handles. So you have lots of animal representations here. Have a closer picture that you can see. So here you can see a labeling of all the different symbols that you see, just beautifully, masterfully crafted. The detail that is included in this is so beautiful. And then here you can also see an image of the text that's included, the calligraphy that's included that gives some idea of the function of this object, the donor, and the date associated with it. I have this really incredible video that I'm going to add here that gives an insight into the process of creating porcelain. This is going to be a focus on the Jingdezhen city, which is a city in China that is known to be the porcelain capital of the world. It's known as a porcelain capital because it is geographically speaking, very conducive to porcelain. They have access to fantastic clay here. There's a river system close by, so there's a lot of access to water, which is really important in porcelain making. There's lots of trees in the area, which make it so that you can produce fire easily to be able to fire the porcelain, to fire the clay. And so the city itself is known to be, just geographically speaking, a place where this type of mastery, artistry could thrive. And this is a really cool video to sort of show that process beginning to end of how it's made. I really wanted to make a quick note about the type of porcelain being created in China at this time and the influence it has in Europe. I mentioned before that this becomes a really popular product within, especially European circles. They find this white and blue porcelain to be so beautiful and this really desirable luxury object. And obviously, being able to transport something from China all the way to Europe is very expensive. Especially something like porcelain. It takes a lot of money, manpower, resources to be able to even transport those things. And so the artisans in Europe become very inspired by the type of porcelain that's coming into Europe. In the 17th century, at the very beginning of the 1600s, basically, you have trade that is happening from the west all the way to the east. And when I say west, I mean Asia to Europe. And I have this map to give you a sense of like the Dutch East India Company is a company that develops basically that's transporting goods from Asia to Europe and vice versa. And one of the things, like I said, is this porcelain. And one thing that the Europeans figure out pretty quickly is, okay, well, maybe it would be cheaper if we just produce these things locally as opposed to trying to transport them from China all the way there. And then, interestingly enough, it takes them a pretty long time to actually figure out the techniques involved with being able to pull something like that off. The materials are different, the resource sources are different in Europe, so obviously they have to adapt a little bit. But eventually, there's a city in the Netherlands known as Delft, and Delft becomes synonymous with the creation of porcelain, and specifically what becomes known as Delftware pottery. And so they produce this really beautiful white and blue porcelain in Delft as well, and then they become this European center for producing those things. What becomes really ironic is the fact that now this blue and white porcelain has become synonymous with the Netherlands. If you've ever been to the Netherlands, anywhere really in the Netherlands, for example, like I've been to Amsterdam, and if you go there, there is pottery everywhere, white and blue pottery specifically, and it has become a product very much associated with that area because they also start to become experts in this technique, which is interesting because this is clearly influenced by China and really was a means of trying to create these products cheaper and to get in on this money that can be made on making these products. So it's an interesting connection. There's a video here that gives a lot of insight into that, that if you want to check out is really fascinating. All right, we're going to move on to our next work. I thought this would be one of the works that would be interesting to see if you could analyze this a bit on your own first. You may recognize this, you may not. You might know the name of what we're looking at here, but maybe you don't know exactly what it is. So just spend a minute looking at what we see here. I want you to think about what stands out to you about the figures that are here. What are the elements that are catching your eye? Why do you think they're catching your eye? Based on what you're seeing here, do you have any sort of guess as to what the function of this might be? Is this meant for public display? Has a religious purpose? Is it a memorial? What do you think? Any guesses you have? I have another slide with some pictures and some questions. So here's a little bit of a close-up of some of the figures. I just want you to think, do you see any similarities or differences in the figures? Think about what the artist who made this might be communicating through the repetition or variation of these figures. And what do you think the mood of these figures is? Is there a scene being portrayed? What would that scene be? And think about how the composition, posture, and the number of figures that you're seeing contribute to that feeling that you're thinking about. So any guesses, throw them out there, see what you think, and then we'll talk more specifically about it. All right, so this is the army of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, also known as the Terracotta Warriors. The Terracotta Warriors are very, very famous because this is an absolutely insane artistic feat that has been pulled off in what we're looking at. And so we'll talk about what that is specifically. So Emperor Shi Huangdi, also known as Qin Shi Huang, we've talked about him before. He is where the name China comes from. He was really the first emperor to unify this larger landmass that becomes modern China, essentially. And in his burial grounds, which we'll talk a little bit more specifically about the context of how this was discovered. But in his burial grounds, he was buried with over 8,000 terracotta warriors, 100 wooden chariots, two bronze chariots, and 30,000 bronze weapons. So it's known as the Terracotta Warriors because these are all figures made of terracotta, and it's literally meant to be an army for the king after he passes, after the emperor passes. This is meant to be an army that he will take with him to the next life. If you remember, we talked about Lady Di, and she was buried with a lot of objects with her that she believed would be carried with her to the afterlife. This is the same sort of thing, right? Is that you want to take with you the things that you need in your next life. And what does this emperor think he needs? He thinks he needs an army, right? So, fascinating thing to put together before your burial, right? So within it, we have a massive citadel. We also have gardens, tables, jewelry, ornaments, so much more. And one of the really interesting things to me too about this is that we don't even know to the full extent what this is. The burial grounds that were discovered was completely by accident. It was discovered when they were doing some reconstructive project in the 1970s, and they discovered this, which is insane. And when they discovered this, the actual warriors who were originally painted started deteriorating very quickly because this is extremely old, right? Like this is over 2,400 years old. This is very, very, very old. So it deteriorated almost immediately after it was discovered. And there was another mound found, which means that we believe that there's even more stuff buried. However, archaeologists don't want to uncover it because they're so afraid of compromising the integrity of it, which makes perfect sense, right? So this is not even the full extent of what we have, which is just mind-boggling to think about. So we know that this would have been a common practice to be buried with the things that you need. And the entire complex is designed not just as like an army, but a whole like area where there's different places for different things. Again, there's gardens, there's a citadel area, there's these rivers basically that you see here filled with mercury, which is interesting because mercury was representative for Chinese people with longevity and eternal life because of the interesting properties that it has. But that's kind of ironic because mercury is also highly poisonous and deadly. And so, there's a lot of examples of important Chinese figures who interact a lot with mercury and like it causes them to die because of mercury poisoning. So one of the really cool things about this as well is every single terracotta warrior has a slightly different slightly different features. So each are individualized. They have different faces, different expressions, different hairstyles, different garments. All of them are meant to be separate people, potentially as a reflection of this idea that they are all individuals philosophically speaking, right? Like according to Taoism, it's all about individualism and seeking the way. So there is evidence of an assembly line style production so that there would have been like maybe several artisans, like, this artisan does the hair, this one does the armor or whatever, right? Like there is evidence that that kind of technique would have happened, but there's still variation amongst these figures, which is really crazy to think about that each single one has different things going on. Um, yeah, and again, I mentioned that the paint there it originally would have been painted, which wore away pretty quickly after its discovery. But we do know that that also would have been a whole nother task to take on, not just constructing these, but then painting them as well. We do also believe that the figures are meant to be idealized. They're slightly over 6 feet tall, which would have been unusually tall for this particular moment in time for the Chinese. So this would have been, yeah, an idealization of your army. And, if you think about it, like if I'm an emperor, I want to be buried with my army. I want to be buried with like good soldiers, right? So I'm going to idealize them. I'm going to show them as strong and powerful, right? Like those things are going to be the things I want in buried with me. And then, yeah, just this was discovered in 1974 at a construction site. I have this link here to a documentary. It's pretty long, so I'm not going to put it in the video lecture. It's about like 45 minutes. But if you have some time to watch it, it's really good. 45 minutes is not that long. If you have some time to watch it, it's really, really fascinating. And they get into the specifics of the construction and the symbolism behind the figures and everything like that. So if you have time, check it out. All right, our next work I want to bring up is going to be something that connects architecture to sculpture, which we've seen kind of over and over again in many different cultures. But it's going to also be bringing up some figures that you might recognize from other units that we've talked about so far. So maybe take a second and see if there's anything you recognize here, if there's any figures you feel like you can confidently identify, why that might be. I'm hoping at the very least you can identify the very central figure, elongated earlobes. We have a halo around or a nimbus around the figure's head. We have a cranial protuberance on the top. They are cross-legged sitting. These are all attributes that are really common in the canon of Buddha. So this is the Buddha sculpture or a Buddha sculpture. This is part of the Longmen Caves. And so let's talk about Buddhism in China. I've mentioned before that Taoism is a significant influence, philosophically speaking, as well as Confucianism. But Buddhism also plays a role in certain parts of China and becomes um, a religious influence as well. So let's look at this example of that. So this is again the Longmen Caves. This is located in Luoyang, China. I have a map on the next page to kind of give you a sense of like exactly where this is located. And the Longmen Caves are interesting because they're sort of similar. If you remember the big sculptures, the Bamiyan Buddhas that we saw that are located in Afghanistan, you have this large uh, uh cliffside basically where you have all of these tiny niches carved out. Very similarly, we see that here. So we actually have this really long, about 1 kilometer area along the Yi River in this area. And then there's lots of different sculptures, rooms cut out of the mountainside that are pretty much small temples, places of worship, and we'll see some examples of that. We see a lot of tradition coming from Indian sculpture here, which makes sense because this is a sculpture of Buddha, and Buddha is a religion from India. And so when you're depicting Buddha, you're going to see that influence with combination of influences from China as well, obviously. So the sculptures that we're seeing here are again part of this complex that includes over 110,000 Buddha statues. That is just an astronomical, like it's hard to wrap your head around that many types of statues. And when I say that, that's going to be these really huge ones like this one we're seeing here, this 55 feet tall one, including smaller ones that are along the way as well. We have over 60 stupas. Remember, stupas are these mound sort of shaped architectural structures that are meant to call to your mind a burial site, specifically where Buddha would have been buried. So this is meant to be connected to him. There's over 2,300 caves and niches. Again, these little worship areas, temples, like mini temples, and 2,800 inscriptions along this 1 kilometer of along the Yi River. This was created again in the Luoyang, the city of Luoyang, which is the capital of China during the late Wei and early Tang dynasties, which eventually changes, but this at this time would have been the capital. The inscriptions show that the primary person paying for this was the Empress Wu Zetian, and we know that because we have her inscriptions as part of the Fengshuan Temple, which is shown here. This is like the primary area of the Longmen Caves where you have this huge Buddhist sculpture. But I don't want you to get the impression that it's just this area. This is a whole complex over a really, really long distance. This particular Fengshuan Temple is just like sort of like the central area, if that makes sense. So we see all these different figures, and you can tell that they're portrayed quite differently, and that is going to be indicative of the roles that each of them play. And I have a slide in a little bit that's going to give you a better sense of like what role each of them plays. But I want you to notice that each of them look quite different. They're posed differently. They have different facial expressions, and that each really gives a sense of the purpose of each of them. And we'll talk about that in just a second. The very central figure that we have here is a depiction of a Vairocana or a universal Buddha. So this is not meant to be, the Buddha within his life. This is not supposed to be Siddhartha Gautama. This is a very particular type of Buddha, which is this sort of universal eternal Buddha. And then we have these different figures attending him. So that includes guardians, monk attendants, heavenly kings, and bodhisattvas. We're going to talk about what that is in just a minute. So we have this supreme Buddha deity essentially in the middle, and then these attendants. And I'm going to show you, excuse me, a quote from a scholar that's going to give you a sense of how this construction was meant to sort of political purposes as well as not just religious purposes. So here's a picture on the left to give you a sense of that larger complex. So again, you can sort of see the Fengshuan temple right in the middle. You can see like those big figures, but there's all these little alcoves, these niches that have been carved out on either side that protrude in either direction. So again, this is a whole complex of various different places you can go in and out and walk through these areas. The map I have on the right just gives you a sense of where this is. And I think this is important because it shows how far east that Buddhism and extends all the way to China or to, excuse me, Japan as well. So we know that Buddhism has this really large influence over this really huge geographic area. Okay, so here is the Fengshuang Temple with all of these figures, and this is gonna hopefully give you the best idea of what these figures are. The best way I can explain it or sort of have you in like conceptualize this is it reminds me a little bit of like a chessboard. So when you think about like your chess pieces, you have the king and the queen right in the middle, right? And then you have figures that extend out in pairs, right? So right next to the king and queen, you have the bishops? No, I can't remember. That's terrible. I should know that. But you have in some order, I can't remember exactly. You have bishops, you have the knights, which are the little horse ones, and then you have the towers. Oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. I don't remember. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But you understand. So you have these figures that extend in pairs outside. So in the very middle, you have the Buddha figure, right? So that's the central figure. That'd be kind of like the king and queen right in the middle. And then on either side of Buddha, you have these monk figures. So monks are religious figures. They're people who try to live a life like Buddha. Depending on what kind of monk you are, you typically are meant to like serve the community and you focus on meditation, like those kind of things. And they're meant to be very spiritually connected. So the idea is that they're the closest to the Buddha figure, right? Because they are the most connected to spirituality. On either side of the monk figures, and you have the bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas are essentially like angels. They're spiritual figures that are helpers for the Buddha. Then on either side of that, you have the heavenly king. So the heavenly king is sort of this ambiguous figure of basically a person of political power in an earthly realm, but also again has connections to, you know, Buddha, spirituality. And then on either side of the kings, you have Vajrapani. Vajrapani are thunderbolt holders. They're essentially like warriors and protectors. They're sort of guardian figures to help protect the realm. So here I have a quote that gives you a sense of what exactly this organization is meant to show you. So I'm going to read this. This is from Dr. Jennifer M. McIntyre. Vairocana, so that central Buddha figure, represents the primordial Buddha who generates and presides over all the Buddhas. So there's this idea that, there's different Buddhas serving different purposes throughout the infinite universe. Anyway, so presides over all the Buddhas of the infinite universes that form Buddhist cosmology. This idea of the power of one supreme deity over all others resonated in the vast Tang Empire, which was dominated by the emperor at its summit and supported by his subordinate officials. These monumental sculptures intentionally mirrored the political situation. The dignity and imposing presence of Buddha and the sumptuous appearance of his attendant bodhisattvas is significant in this context. So essentially what she's saying here is that this sort of organization is meant to also reflect the political situation, the idea that you have a central king or emperor figure, and then they have their attendants that extend out and sort of have um, power in their own way, but that they all come back to the primary power of the Buddha, who is the central figure. The next object we're looking at comes from Korea, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about Korean production, and this is going to give us a lot of insight into the type of metalworking and production that is happening in Korea at the time, particularly this area of Korea, which is sort of the southeastern region of Korea. So this object we're looking at is known as a daegwon. It's basically a crown that would have been worn by a high power official, particularly probably a king. We have evidence that maybe other people were wearing it, but predominantly it would have been associated with a king or an emperor of some sort. This one was unearthed from a royal tomb in the Gyeongju area of China, or excuse me, China, Korea. And again, this area of Korea was well known for its metalworking, particularly its use of gold. They had access to gold, and was very known for having wealth associated with that. So similar to China's royalty, Silla royalty, which was a Korean dynasty, would have been buried in lavish tombs. So this would have been something that they would have spent a lot of time, resources, be able to be buried with objects that they wanted with them, with them, which also signified their status. Prior to the influence of Buddhism in Korea, we know that the type of religion that was practiced in this area was mostly shamanistic. So this idea that there's worship of nature, oftentimes associations with this idea of a person like a shaman who is able to connect to nature, connect to spirits. So the crown you're seeing here is going to give you, here, let me see if you can see better now, give you a sense of natural shapes, particularly the shape of a tree. So if you look at the very center, it looks like a tree with branches coming off, and then potentially on either side is meant to represent antlers. So again, these naturally occurring symbols being represented here. We also know that this type of crown would have been potentially produced by the Scytho-Siberian people that occupied the Eurasian steppe. So when you think about a map of Asia, we know that Korea is connected to China, and then you have this area like you have Mongolia, and then you have Russia. So this area of Siberia that connects is, there's influences here from this area of Russia all the way down to Korea. So there's this, mixing there. The image of the tree potentially has associations with a world tree like Mount Meru. Again, Mount Meru is not something that was just like invented during Buddhism. This predated Buddhism, but it became really important to Buddhist cosmology. So there's this idea of this central tree, this tree that the rest of the universe emanates from. One of the cool things too is you'll notice that there's these hanging jade elements to the crown. These are meant to look similar to hanging fruit, like on a fruit tree. So this idea of these branches with fruit hanging, like ripe fruit particularly, which gives this idea of fertility and abundance and prosperity, right? Like this idea that you have these resources like food plentiful for you. The gold work would have also been really stunning to see in the light, potentially making these connections with the sun, right? Because the sun is going to be what is illuminating it. This idea of the brilliance and light of the sun being conveyed here, um, which is going to give this sense again of these natural resources, right? Like the gold, the jade, the sun hitting it, all of these things are really natural elements that are being put together in a way to also be symbolic of nature with a tree and the antlers and things like that. So this gives you a sense of the luxury that they have, but also the connection to nature, particularly found in the Silla dynasty in Korea. All right, before we move on to our last work, which is an architectural structure, I want to talk briefly about the history and development of architecture in China and also Japan, because we're going to see similar styles. So we're going to talk about a pagoda structure and a courtyard and courtyard style architecture, because we're going to see both of those things in the structure we're looking at. Now, a pagoda style, you might have heard of pagoda or seen a pagoda before, maybe in the media or something like that. A pagoda is a particular type of architectural structure that is typically going to be multiple levels of an architectural structure that get slightly smaller as they go up. And architectural historians have really established this clean influence that started with the stupa, the Buddhist, well, which a stupa really extends before Buddhism, but becomes a really important Buddhist structure. But we have the Indian stupa that eventually evolves into a later type style of Indian stupa that becomes more of, because remember, a stupa is originally not meant to be navigated from an interior, not from the interior, but rather to be circumambulated to go around it. But eventually, that type of style becomes architectural space that you can actually go inside. And then over time, that turns into a much larger structure, which becomes known as the Chinese pagoda, which develops in China. And eventually, Japan builds even taller structures on top of that, which become the Japanese pagoda style. So these styles evolve over a really long period of time, but originate in the stupa style. Now, courtyard style architecture, we've seen something sort of similar when we talked about ancient Rome, but a courtyard style architecture is really going to be interior architectural space that is meant to give privacy. So it allows for structures to be built next to each other, but you still have privacy and you still have light being able to come in through these courtyards as well as outdoor space, but it's still within the confines of your own private space, if that makes sense. So that means that you have interior space that you live in, residences, your kitchen, whatever else, in this exterior part, and then this interior part is left blank, so that it's space that you can go and you're outside, but you're still in a private area. And then that evolves over time and becomes more complex, where there's going to be multiple courtyards with lots of different buildings that are attached to one another. So the pagoda style, it becomes really important in Chinese architecture as well as this courtyard style architecture. So this picture that we're looking at is the front entrance depiction of the Forbidden City. So the Forbidden City is the largest architectural structure in all of China. So it's extremely important. Historically, it served an important purpose. Today it's a museum, but we're going to talk about its original function. This is a like a replica or a small replica of the entirety of the Forbidden City structure. This is a massive complex. Now, when I say it's the biggest architectural structure, it's not one architectural structure. It's many, many different structures put together, but it's really a complex of buildings that are all meant to serve a greater royal purpose. So the Forbidden City was built around the 1400s in Beijing, China. This is around the time that Beijing becomes the capital of China, and this becomes the primary palatial structure in this in Beijing. So you see the incorporation of a pagoda style. You can see that in the pitched roof that is shown here, as well as the layers. It shows that it has multiple stories to it. Which is again originating from the stupa style. We also clearly have a courtyard style because we have tons of exterior space, but within the confines of this larger Forbidden City complex, which has these walls on the outside of it, which is in a completely enclosed area, but then there's exterior space in the middle of it. We have lots of red and yellow incorporated. Red and yellow are extremely important colors in China. It's the colors of the flag that are shown on the Chinese flag, and they have symbolism associated with Chinese philosophies. So red is associated with good fortune, joy, happiness, and prosperity, and yellow symbolizes royalty, power, and the divine mandate to rule. So the combination of those two really give us a sense that this is meant to be like a royal space. So this is the largest, most complete Chinese architectural structure. It has over 98 buildings or not over, it has 98 buildings and 9,000 rooms inside the complex. And the exterior walls that enclose the entire thing are over 30 feet high to keep people out. That's part of the reason that this is known as a forbidden city. It was meant to be a complex for royalty to live and to conduct royal business and that kind of thing. And so it was forbidden because people couldn't just come in and out willy-nilly. It was very fortified. It was really hard to get in. Um, so it was a space that really, unless you were royalty, unless you were invited in, or unless you were someone working there, you would not be going into the Forbidden City. There's two main areas of this structure. I have some more pictures that'll give you a sense of that, and that's the outer court and the inner court. The outer court is closer to the front gate, to the sort of entryway. And then the inner court is more like basically you go from the outer court into the inner court. And the idea is the outer court is meant to be more outward facing in the sense of like these are the spaces for like the throne room and for guests to visit, right? Like those are the type of spaces, this is where governmental work is happening. Whereas the interior, or not the interior, the inner court is where the palace residences are. This is where more day-to-day activities, that's more of the like intimate spaces. Um, Yeah, so I basically said all that already. Yeah, and this was the political and ritual center for China for over 500 years. It was constructed again in the 1400s, and it was established as the most important structure and associated with royalty and political power until the 20th century when China became a communist state, and kind of changed their philosophies around politics, and they no longer use this big ostentatious building to represent the government. Here's an image to show again this idea of the inner court and the outer court. Again, the outer court is going to have bigger, more spectacular, splendid, impressive buildings because it's meant to be for more people viewing, getting a sense of what this government represents. And then the inner court has a lot of smaller buildings, little residences for people individually, places for servants to work, that kind of thing. So the Forbidden City, also scholars have noted the symbolism behind this kind of structure. So I'm going to read this quote. Since the Forbidden City is a ceremonial ritual and living space, the architects who designed its layout follow the ideal cosmic order in Confucian ideology. So remember, in Confucianism, there's this idea that social structure really is all about understanding your role socially. There's always superior or dominant and subordinate relationships. If you're in the superior position, you have responsibility towards the subordinate, but you also have power over them. And if you're the subordinate, you are meant to be loyal, but you also have someone watching out for you, right? So every relationship is contingent on you dutifully fulfilling your role within that relationship. So you have this idea here in Confucian ideology, and it held Chinese social structure together, for centuries. The layout ensured that all activities within the micro city were conducted in the manner appropriate to the participants' social and familial roles. So even the construction of this architectural space is going to give you a sense of where you lie in the social order. The bigger, more fabulous structure you have, the more power you probably have. But you also have responsibility to take care of people, whereas the smaller structures mean you're probably subordinate, and you're meant to show loyalty and fealty to the people in the higher positions of power to you. So really, your architectural space that you were in was reflective of your social role. All activities such as imperial court ceremonies or life cycle rituals would take place in sophisticated palaces depending on the event's characteristics. Similarly, the court determined the occupants of this forbidden city strictly according to their positions in the imperial family. The architectural style also reflects a sense of hierarchy. So again, hierarchy where you are in the social role. Each structure was designed in accordance with the treaties on architectural methods or state building standards. We don't really have time to go into all that, but we could if we had time. The structure of the Forbidden City reflects an ideal sense of order and hierarchy under the rule of the emperor. The size, structure, and placement of each building dictate its importance and the activities that take place there. And that's really the thing I want you to take from this, is that the architectural structure really reflects Confucian ideology in this sense of social order. Here are a couple of the specific buildings just to give you a sense of what some of these structures look like. The front gate or Meridian Gate, which is this top picture, is the front entryway basically that leads into the Forbidden City. Again, it doesn't look like a super inviting, it's not meant to bring in a bunch of people, right? Like that's really going to be something that is, for people to come in, is going to necessitate a relationship with the emperor, whoever's inviting. We do have this big picture here of Mao Zedong, who is a really important political figure in the 20th century. This wouldn't really have had any association with the construction of this. So that's sort of like a representation of later politics. And then Hall of Supreme Harmony is the biggest structure within the Forbidden City. So this would have been the principal structure that would have done big events, rituals would have taken place here. The throne room is here, right? So you would have had your big New Year and the winter solstice rituals and festivities in this space. And I have some pictures of the interior. This is in the interior. And again, reds, yellows, these are really important colors. And you have this large, elaborate throne right in the center of it. Here's a structure, and you can see it on the map where this is located. So you have the Meridian Gate, which is the entryway. The Hall of Supreme Harmony is still in the inner or in the outer court, and it's in the outer court because it's closer to the front basically, and it's more for like outside people. I shouldn't say outside people, but the for like rituals and things like that for people to come together. And then as you get more into the interior court where you have more residential places and day-to-day places, this is an example of that. This is the Palace of Tranquility and Longevity. This was designed to be the translation of its title literally translates to peaceful old age palace. So it's meant to be a place that emperors, when they were sort of at the tail end of their ruling, or if you have people that are older, this would be a place for them to be at peace and to have tranquility. It's kind of like a retirement palace. So this was meant to serve that purpose. I have this video that is going to show what this structure looks like in more of like a modern context. I'm going to add that here at the end. But that is our last structure and our last work that we will be talking about for Chinese and Korean art. Let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to send me an email anytime. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed.
In 1420, in an effort to consolidate his control over the throne, the emperor of the Ming Dynasty moved China's capital to a site in the north now known as Beijing. There, he built a vast complex of palaces and administrative buildings now covering 178 acres. Because access was restricted to members of the imperial family and those serving or having business with them, it came to be known as the Forbidden City. From here, 24 emperors of the Ming and Qing dynasties ruled their vast country for over 500 years. The emperor's new palace took 1 million workers almost 20 years to construct. Everything from the location of the main buildings on the north-south axis, the colors of roofs and walls, to the number of bosses on doors carries symbolic meaning. The precise design of the palace reflected the order that the emperor was meant to bestow on his empire. A visitor to the Forbidden City would have passed through several gates before reaching the Meridian Gate, the main entrance to the palace. This visitor was then required to enter through one of the smaller side doors. One crossed the River of Golden Water and passed through another gate before approaching the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the largest building in the Forbidden City. Here, military and civil officials lined up for an audience with the emperor. Officials checked that everyone was in the right spot and correctly attired. Then music sounded, and the emperor was carried into the hall in his yellow palanquin. The emperor was traditionally associated with the dragon. Seated on his dragon throne, wearing a dragon robe, the emperor represented the apex of the empire. But the daily business of the empire was conducted in the inner court. This was where the emperor, his empress, and concubines lived, attended by numerous maidservants and eunuchs. The inner court mirrors the layout of the outer court on a smaller scale, but residences and gardens give it a more intimate feel. Still, all the luxury should not conceal the fact that for the women in the palace, and even the emperor, the Forbidden City was a golden cage. The inhabitants rarely got to leave once they entered. Throughout the Forbidden City, all possible precautions were taken to guard against the greatest danger for its buildings: fire. Animals and figures on the roofs guarded against fires and evil spirits. But all the auspicious symbols and elaborate rituals could not prevent the end of China's empire in 1911. For it was then that 6-year-old Pu Yi abdicated the throne. For the first time in China's history, ordinary people were soon able to enter the Forbidden City. The once inaccessible palace is now a museum and a monument to China's glorious past.